Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest aristocratic pastimes you've never heard of. The French nobility's bizarre obsession with collecting snails. Not for eating, mind you, but for sport, prestige, and the kind of competitive pride that would make modern collectors of trading cards seem perfectly reasonable by comparison. Picture yourself walking through the manicured gardens of Versailles in 1763. The air hangs heavy with the scent of roses and lavender. Courtiers in powdered wigs and silk stockings drift past fountains that cost more than entire villages. And there, beneath a carefully trimmed boxwood hedge, you spot something peculiar. A grown man, resplendent in velvet breeches and a coat adorned with gold thread, crawling on his hands and knees through the damp grass, peering intently at a common garden snail. This was not madness. This was sport. The practice began, as so many peculiar aristocratic hobbies did, with boredom and excess wealth. The French nobility of the mid-18th century found themselves in a unique position. They were rich beyond measure, educated in the sciences and natural philosophy, yet largely prohibited from engaging in commerce or trade. Such activities were considered beneath their station. They needed something to occupy their time, something that demonstrated both their refined sensibilities and their superior breeding. Enter the humble snail, or as they preferred to call them in those days, escargot de collection. The Comte de Buffon, Georges-Louis Leclerc, was one of the first to legitimize this peculiar interest. As keeper of the Jardin du Roi in Paris and author of the massive Histoire naturelle, Buffon brought scientific respectability to the study of mollusks. His writings described snails not as mere garden pests, but as creatures of remarkable complexity and beauty. He catalogued their shells with the same care a jeweler might use to describe precious stones, noting the spirals, the striations, the subtle variations in color from cream to amber to the palest pink. But Buffon's scientific approach was just the beginning. What transformed snail observation into snail collection was the influence of the emerging natural history cabinets. Those rooms filled with shells, minerals, pressed flowers, and preserved specimens that every educated gentleman was expected to maintain. If you could collect seashells from distant shores, why not collect the shells of terrestrial mollusks from your own estate? The Duc d'Orléans, Philippe II, took this concept and elevated it into something approaching sport. In his extensive gardens at the Palais Royal, he established what he called a gastropod reserve, a section of carefully maintained habitat designed specifically to attract and sustain various species of snails. He employed gardeners whose sole responsibility was the cultivation of environments favorable to different mollusk varieties. Some areas were kept perpetually damp and shaded, planted with the specific herbs and leaves that certain snails preferred. Others were allowed to become overgrown with moss and lichen, creating the perfect microclimate for rarer species. The Duke kept meticulous records. In leather-bound journals, he noted the date and location of each specimen collected, the weather conditions, the phase of the moon, and detailed descriptions of coloration and shell structure. He sketched them with surprising skill, capturing the delicate translucence of their bodies and the mathematical precision of their shells. These journals, some of which survive in French archives today, reveal a mind completely absorbed in what most would consider a trivial pursuit. But to understand why this mattered to men like the Duc d'Orléans, you must understand the culture of natural philosophy that dominated educated circles in 18th century France. This was the age of Linnaeus, whose systematic classification of all living things had revolutionized how Europeans understood nature. To collect, to classify, to observe. These were not idle pastimes, but participation in the grand project of cataloguing God's creation. Every snail had its place in the great chain of being, and to understand that place was to glimpse divine order. The social aspect soon followed. By 1765, informal gatherings of snail enthusiasts began meeting in Paris salons. These were not the literary salons of Madame de Staël or the philosophical discussions of the encyclopédiste, but something stranger and more specialized. Gentlemen would bring their finest specimens, mounted in small display cases lined with velvet. They would pass these around, examining each shell through magnifying glasses, debating points of taxonomy, and sharing tips on habitat cultivation. Competition naturally emerged. Who could find the largest specimen of the common garden snail, Helix aspersa? Who could collect the widest variety of species from a single estate? Who could breed snails to produce the most aesthetically pleasing shells? Yes, breeding. By the 1770s, some collectors had moved beyond simple collection to attempting controlled breeding programs. They would select snails with desirable shell characteristics and house them in special enclosures, hoping to produce offspring that exhibited enhanced versions of those traits. The success rate was, unsurprisingly, quite low. Snails are hermaphroditic, and their reproductive habits are complex and not entirely predictable. But this did not deter the enthusiasts. The Marquis de Condorcet, better known for his contributions to mathematics and political philosophy, maintained a breeding facility in the cellars of his Parisian townhouse. He constructed terraria of different sizes, each with carefully controlled humidity and temperature. He experimented with different diets, feeding his snails everything from lettuce to rose petals to see if it affected shell development. His notes suggest he believed that snails fed exclusively on herbs would produce shells with a more lustrous finish, though there is no evidence this theory held any merit. What's remarkable is the seriousness with which these men approached their hobby. These were the same individuals who debated the rights of man, who corresponded with Voltaire and Rousseau, who managed vast estates and wielded political influence. Yet they devoted hours, sometimes entire days, to crawling through gardens in search of mollusks. The equipment they developed was equally elaborate. Special collecting boxes were commissioned from cabinet makers, featuring multiple drawers lined with soft materials to prevent shell damage. Magnifying glasses on adjustable stands allowed for detailed examination. Some collectors commissioned portable shelters, essentially small tents, that could be erected in the garden to provide shade during extended collecting sessions. The fashion even influenced garden design. Estates began featuring wild corners, areas deliberately left unkempt to attract wildlife, including snails. This was revolutionary in an era when formal French gardens represented the triumph of human order over natural chaos. Now, aristocrats were creating controlled chaos, carefully orchestrated wilderness designed to support mollusk populations. Servants were trained in proper snail handling techniques. There were correct and incorrect ways to pick up a snail, methods to avoid damaging the shell or causing the creature undue stress. Some households employed individuals whose primary responsibility was snail care, feeding, cleaning habitats, monitoring for diseases that might affect the collection. The investment was not insignificant. A well-appointed snail collection room with its custom cabinetry, preserved specimens, and breeding facilities could cost as much as a coach and horses. But for those who could afford it, the expense was justified by the prestige it brought. Because, make no mistake, this was about prestige. In a society where one's worth was measured not by what one did, but by what one possessed, and how one spent one's leisure time, a sophisticated snail collection demonstrated both scientific knowledge and the kind of refined sensibility that separated the truly cultured from mere wealth. It showed you had the education to appreciate natural philosophy, the patience for systematic study, and the taste to recognize beauty in unlikely places. Letters from the period reveal the social dynamics at play. Collectors would write to one another, describing recent acquisitions, sometimes in the breathless language usually reserved for art purchases or romantic conquests. I have obtained a specimen of such remarkable proportions and spiral perfection that I dare not trust its description to mere words, wrote one collector to another in 1772. You must visit at your earliest convenience to witness this marvel yourself. And they did visit. Viewing another collector's snails became a recognized social obligation, complete with its own etiquette. One arrived at a specified hour, typically mid-morning when the light was best for viewing. The host would present specimens in a particular order, building toward the finest examples. Guests were expected to offer thoughtful commentary, to notice subtle details, to ask informed questions. But what of the snails themselves? What was it actually like for these creatures, plucked from their ordinary existence and thrust into the rarefied world of French aristocratic collecting? The truth is, most snails probably fared reasonably well. They were kept in environments that mimicked their natural habitats, fed regularly, and protected from predators. Some specimens lived for years in these collections, far longer than they might have survived in the wild. The collectors, despite their eccentricity, genuinely cared about the welfare of their charges. A dead snail was a failed collection piece, after all. Yet there was something undeniably absurd about the whole enterprise. These were, at the end of the day, common garden snails. They could be found in any vegetable patch in France. They had no particular economic value, no practical use beyond being edible. But that was precisely the point. To devote oneself to something utterly impractical, to find profound meaning in the mundane, was the ultimate expression of aristocratic leisure. The question that begins to emerge as we examine this peculiar chapter of history is this: what does it tell us about a society when its elite becomes so disconnected from practical concerns that they can devote themselves entirely to the collection and classification of garden pests? Were these men escaping from something, or searching for something? And as their world began to crack and shift in the years leading up to the French Revolution, did anyone pause to consider whether time spent cataloging snails might have been better spent addressing the grievances that would soon consume them? The transformation of snail collecting from individual eccentricity to organized social movement occurred with surprising rapidity. By 1775, what had begun as the private hobby of a handful of aristocrats had evolved into something approaching an institution, complete with its own rules, hierarchies, and bitter rivalries. The catalyst for this transformation was the founding of the Société des Amateurs d'Escargots, the Society of Snail Enthusiasts, in the spring of 1774. The Society's first meeting took place in a rented room above a bookseller's shop on the Rue Saint-Jacques in Paris. 12 men attended, representing some of the most distinguished names in French nobility and intellectual life. They sat around a table covered in green baize, examining specimens that members had brought to share, and they drafted a constitution. This constitution, preserved in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, is a remarkable document. It runs to 17 pages of densely written text, outlining everything from membership criteria to proper specimen documentation procedures. Reading it today, you cannot help but be struck by the earnestness of its language, the absolute seriousness with which these men approached their unusual pursuit. Membership in the society was limited to 40 individuals at any given time. Prospective members had to be proposed by 2 existing members and demonstrate both a serious collection and substantive knowledge of gastropod natural history. They paid annual dues of 50 livres, a considerable sum, roughly equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in 2 months. These funds supported the Society's activities, the rental of meeting rooms, the publication of a quarterly journal, and the maintenance of a reference collection housed in borrowed space at the Jardin du Roi. The quarterly journal, titled Observations sur les gastéropodes de France, began publication in January 1775. Each issue ran to approximately 60 pages and featured detailed articles on various aspects of snail natural history, collecting techniques, and habitat management. The writing was dense and technical, filled with Latin taxonomy and precise measurements. Illustrations were commissioned from professional engravers, showing snails in exquisite detail, every whirl of the shell, every subtle gradation of color rendered with scientific precision. You must understand that this was not simply a vanity publication. The contributors genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge. They were documenting variations in shell morphology, mapping the geographic distribution of different species, and attempting to understand the factors that influence snail behavior and development. Some of their observations were actually quite sound. They noted, for instance, that snails in limestone-rich soil tended to have thicker, more robust shells than those in acidic soils, a finding that modern malacologists have confirmed. The Society's monthly meetings became events of considerable social importance. They were held on the first Tuesday of each month, beginning at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and often extending well into the evening. The format was rigidly structured. First came the reading of the minutes from the previous meeting. Then members would present new acquisitions, passing their specimens around the table for examination and commentary. After this, there would be a formal presentation on some aspect of snail natural history, perhaps a paper on the dietary preferences of different species, or observations on seasonal variation in shell coloration. The Society's secretary, the Chevalier de Lamarck, who would later become famous for his evolutionary theories, kept meticulous records of these meetings. His minutes reveal the kinds of discussions that occupied these gatherings. There were debates about taxonomy. Should certain varieties be classified as separate species or merely regional variants? There were practical discussions about collection management. What was the best method for cleaning shells without damaging their delicate surfaces? There were even theoretical arguments about snail cognition. Did these creatures possess any form of memory or learning capability? But beneath the scientific veneer, social dynamics and personal rivalries simmered. The Society's membership represented a cross-section of French elite society, and these men brought their ambitions and resentments with them into the meeting room. The most famous rivalry was between the Comte de Réaumur's nephew, Jacques Ferchaud, and the Baron de Montesquieu's grandson, Charles-Louis de Secondat. Both men claimed to possess the finest collection of Helix pomatia, the Roman snail, prized for its large size and distinctive shell pattern. Their competition became legendary within society circles. Ferchaud had advantages of resources. His family estate in the Loire Valley encompassed thousands of acres, including extensive forests and marshlands that provided diverse snail habitats. He employed a full-time naturalist to oversee his collection and had commissioned the construction of an elaborate snail house, a building devoted entirely to housing his specimens and breeding stock. Secondat countered with connections and intellectual prestige. His grandfather's fame opened doors throughout Europe's scientific community. He corresponded with naturalists in England, Germany, and Italy, trading specimens and knowledge. He published prolifically in the Society's journal, establishing himself as one of the foremost authorities on French gastropods. Their rivalry came to a head at the Society's annual exhibition in June 1778. This event, held in a gallery loaned by the Académie Royale des Sciences, was open to the public and attracted considerable attention. It was an opportunity for collectors to display their finest specimens and for the Society to demonstrate the seriousness of their pursuit to a broader audience. Verschow arrived with a specimen of Helix pomatia that was truly extraordinary. A snail with a shell measuring nearly 2 inches in diameter, with coloring so vivid it seemed almost unnatural. The shell's spiral was mathematically perfect, and its surface had a lustrous quality that caught and reflected light like polished stone. He displayed it in a custom-made case of rosewood and glass, lined with midnight blue velvet. A small placard provided the specimen's vital statistics and the date and location of collection. Secondat's response was more subtle, but equally impressive. Rather than a single spectacular specimen, he presented a series of 20 shells, arranged to demonstrate the natural variation within a single species. Each had been collected from a different region of France, and each showed distinct characteristics, differences in size, color, shell thickness, and spiral configuration. Beside the display, he had mounted a map showing collection locations and a detailed chart analyzing the environmental factors that might account for the observed variations. The judges, 5 senior members of the Society tasked with evaluating exhibits, found themselves in an impossible position. Verschow's specimen was objectively superior as an individual example, but Secondat's display demonstrated deeper scientific understanding and methodological sophistication. After 3 hours of deliberation, they awarded the exhibition's gold medal to Secondat, while creating a special commendation for Verschow's exceptional individual specimen. Verschow never forgave the slight. He resigned from the Society the following month, taking several of his allies with him and founding a rival organization, the Académie des Sciences Naturelles et Gastéropodie. This new group positioned itself as more scientifically rigorous, less concerned with social pleasantries, and more focused on advancing genuine knowledge. The split was acrimonious and public. Letters were exchanged in the pages of various journals, each side accusing the other of dilettantism or social climbing. It became impossible to be a member of both organizations. Collectors had to choose sides. For several years, Parisian natural history circles were divided into 2 camps, each convinced of its own superiority and the other's foolishness. Yet even as these elite collectors squabbled, the practice of snail collecting was spreading to the provincial nobility and even to wealthy members of the bourgeoisie. By the early 1780s, regional societies had formed in Lyon, Bordeaux, and Toulouse. Smaller collectors, unable to compete with the resources of great aristocrats, carved out their own niches. Some specialized in particular species. Others focused on snails from specific geographic regions. A few pioneered the collection of shells, showing unusual abnormalities or mutations. The economic impact was not insignificant. Suppliers emerged to serve the growing community of collectors. Specialized tools, delicate forceps for handling snails, custom-designed terraria, preservation supplies, became available from instrument makers. Publishers produced field guides and reference works. Artists found steady employment, creating illustrations for journals and private collections. There were even professional snail hunters, individuals who would travel to remote areas searching for rare specimens, which they would then sell to collectors. These were often men of limited means who possessed sharp eyes and knowledge of local habitats. They operated in a grey area between legitimate commerce and something approaching poaching, especially when they collected on private estates without permission. The letters and journals from this period reveal how consuming the hobby could become. Collectors would rise before dawn to search for snails in the early morning, when they were most active. They would spend hours preparing and cataloguing specimens. They would neglect other responsibilities, sometimes to the frustration of family members and estate managers. One wife, writing to her sister in 1781, complained that her husband had become entirely possessed by his mollusk madness. He had converted 3 rooms of their chateau into collection and breeding spaces. He corresponded with fellow collectors across Europe, but had little time for his own children. He could discourse at length about the anatomical features of various snail species, but had grown distant and distracted in ordinary conversation. Yet for the collectors themselves, this obsession filled a genuine need. In their detailed observations and careful classifications, they found order and meaning. The natural world, when approached systematically, revealed patterns and principles. Each specimen told a story of adaptation, of geographic distribution, of the relationship between organism and environment. To understand these stories was to participate in something larger than oneself, to contribute to humanity's growing comprehension of the natural world. The irony, of course, is that they were studying creatures that most people considered barely worth noticing. Snails were garden pests, agricultural nuisances, or at best, a food source. That educated gentleman would devote such energy to them seemed baffling to outside observers. Satirical prints began appearing, caricaturing aristocrats on their hands and knees, searching for snails, while peasants starved and the nation's finances crumbled. Because by the 1780s, France was in trouble. The expenses of supporting American independence had devastated royal finances. Crop failures led to bread shortages. The tax system, which exempted the nobility while burdening peasants and merchants, was increasingly recognized as unjust and unsustainable. Political tensions were rising, and through it all, in their gardens and salons, the snail collectors continued their meticulous work, seemingly oblivious to the gathering storm. They debated the finer points of shell morphology. They competed for rare specimens. They published their journals and held their exhibitions. They lived in a world of their own making, one where the greatest concerns were scientific accuracy and collection prestige. Some were more aware than others. The Marquis de Condorcet, that mathematician and snail breeder, was also a political reformer who would soon throw himself into the revolutionary cause. He saw no contradiction between his scientific hobbies and his political engagement. Both were expressions of rational inquiry and the Enlightenment spirit, but he was unusual in his ability to balance these worlds. For most collectors, the snails represented an escape from complexity into something simpler and more controllable. You could not control grain prices or royal policy or the mood of the Paris mob, but you could control the environment in your snail terrariums. You could organize your collection according to rational principles. You could find certainty in taxonomy and comfort in routine. As the decade progressed and political tensions increased, some collectors began to sense that their world was becoming unstable. There are hints in private letters, mentions of selling off parts of collections to raise cash, concerns about the safety of maintaining conspicuous displays of wealth, discussions about whether it might be wise to relocate specimens to country estates away from Paris. But what would happen when the revolution finally came? How would these careful collections, these monuments to aristocratic leisure and scientific curiosity, fare in the upheaval ahead? And what would become of the collectors themselves, these men who had devoted themselves so completely to such an impractical pursuit? The summer of 1789 arrived in France with oppressive heat and electric tension. In Paris, breadlines stretched around city blocks. Political pamphlets circulated through cafes and marketplaces, their language growing increasingly radical. The Estates General had been called for the first time in over a century, and suddenly the impossible seemed possible. Fundamental change to the ancient order of French society. On July 14th, as crowds stormed the Bastille, the Société des Amateurs d'Escargot was holding its monthly meeting. The members gathered in their usual room, though attendance was notably thin. Only 18 of the 40 members appeared, and those who did seemed distracted. The presentation that afternoon, a paper on the relationship between shell thickness and calcium availability in soil, was cut short when sounds of commotion drifted through the windows from the streets below. The Chevalier de Lamarck, taking minutes as always, noted simply, "Meeting adjourned early due to disturbances in the city. Next meeting, date uncertain." There would not be another official meeting for 6 years. What followed was a period of profound disruption, not just for French society as a whole, but for the small, strange world of snail collectors. The revolution that swept through France between 1789 and 1799 did not specifically target gastropod enthusiasts, of course, but it targeted everything they represented: aristocratic privilege, conspicuous leisure, the expenditure of resources on frivolous pursuits while common people suffered. The great collections that had taken decades to assemble faced multiple threats. The most immediate was simple neglect. As political chaos engulfed France, collectors found themselves preoccupied with survival. Those who had been most visible, most closely associated with the old regime, faced particular danger. Several members of the Société des Amateurs d'Escargot fled France entirely, leaving their collections behind. Others retreated to country estates, hoping to wait out the turmoil in obscurity. The Comte de Ferchaud, he of the magnificent Helix pomatia specimen that had caused such controversy at the 1778 exhibition, initially tried to maintain his collection even as the political situation deteriorated. His estate manager's reports from 1790 and 1791 show continued expenses for the snail house, food for the breeding stock, repairs to terrariums, wages for the naturalist who oversaw the collection. But by late 1791, as the revolution radicalized and the nobility came under increasing suspicion, these entries cease. Ferchaud himself was arrested in March 1793 on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. The evidence against him was thin, mainly correspondence with émigré relatives and his refusal to publicly support the execution of the king. He was held for 14 months in a Paris prison, during which time his estate was confiscated and sold off piecemeal. His snail collection met an ignominious end. When revolutionary officials inventoried the property, they found the elaborate snail house with its hundreds of specimens, both living and preserved. The commissioner's report, preserved in the Archives Nationales, describes the collection with bewildered disdain. An entire building devoted to the housing of common garden snails, fitted with expensive glass cases and scientific apparatus. The accused has clearly wasted resources that rightfully belong to the people on this absurd aristocratic affectation. The living snails were simply released into the gardens. The preserved specimens, mounted in their custom cases, were deemed to have no value and destroyed. A few shells may have been saved as curiosities by the officials conducting the inventory, but the collection, as a coherent whole, ceased to exist. Decades of careful observation, meticulous documentation, and patient breeding work vanished in an afternoon. Ferchot survived his imprisonment. He was released during the Thermidorian reaction, when the Terror's excesses were being rolled back. But he was a broken man. His property was gone, his collection destroyed, his social position annihilated. He spent his final years living with distant relatives in Normandy, working as a clerk. He never collected snails again. His fate was echoed across France. The Baron de Montesquieu's grandson, Charles-Louis de Secondat, the brilliant naturalist who had bested Ferchot at the 1778 exhibition, was executed in October 1793. The charges were political, not related to his hobby, but his collection suffered the same fate as Ferchot's. His careful documentation of regional variation in Helix pomatia, his correspondence with naturalists across Europe, his years of patient observation, all of it was seized and scattered. Some collections survived through fortunate circumstances. Those collectors who had maintained good relations with local communities, who had treated their tenants fairly and supported local institutions, sometimes found protection. Revolutionary authorities might confiscate estates and possessions, but if local people vouched for an individual's character, there was a chance of leniency. The Marquis de Condorcet's collection survived longer than most, protected by his revolutionary credentials. Condorcet threw himself into the political transformation of France, serving in the National Assembly and contributing to the drafting of a new constitution. His scientific pursuits, including his snail breeding experiments, continued intermittently even as he engaged in political work. But Condorcet's protection proved fragile. When he found himself on the wrong side of factional disputes in 1793, he was forced into hiding. He lived in secret for months, sheltered by sympathizers, working on philosophical writings. When he finally attempted to flee Paris in March 1794, he was arrested in a village south of the city. He died in prison 2 days later, officially from natural causes, though suicide was widely suspected. His snail collection, maintained in the cellars of his Parisian townhouse, survived his death. The house itself was confiscated, but not immediately emptied. For several years, the terrariums in the cellar continued to function, the snails reproducing and dying in their carefully controlled environments, tended by no one. When the building was finally cleared in 1798, workers found shells scattered among the abandoned breeding apparatus, the living snails long since dead from neglect. Yet even amid this destruction, there were those who recognized the value of what was being lost. Some members of the scientific community, those who had survived the terror by keeping their heads down and their politics ambiguous, worked quietly to preserve what they could. The naturalist Georges Cuvier, who would later become one of the most influential scientists of the early 19th century, was a young man during the Revolution. He understood that the collections being destroyed represented irreplaceable scientific data. Working with a small network of like-minded individuals, he managed to save specimens and documents from several destroyed collections, quietly storing them in the spaces of what would eventually become the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. These salvaged materials formed the core of the museum's malacology collection. Shells that had once been the pride of aristocratic collectors, displayed in rosewood cases in elegant salons, now resided in the drawers of a public institution, available to any serious researcher. The social meaning of these objects had transformed completely. What had been markers of privilege and refined taste became democratic scientific resources. The transformation was fitting in its way. The collectors had always claimed that their pursuit was about advancing natural knowledge, contributing to humanity's understanding of the natural world. Now that claim was being tested. Stripped of their social context, removed from the competition and prestige-seeking that had motivated their original assembly, did these collections retain scientific value? The answer, surprisingly, was yes. The careful documentation that collectors like Secondat had maintained, noting collection locations, dates, environmental conditions, proved genuinely useful to later researchers. The preserved specimens allowed comparisons across time, revealing how snail populations had changed in response to agricultural development and land use changes. The breeding experiments, though conducted from curiosity rather than systematic scientific method, had produced observations about gastropod reproduction and development that advanced understanding. In an ironic twist, the aristocratic hobby had generated real science almost accidentally. The collectors had been motivated by competition, by aesthetic appreciation, by the desire to fill leisure hours with something that felt meaningful. But in pursuing these somewhat trivial goals, they had created a body of documented observations that outlived them and their world. By the time Napoleon brought stability to France in 1799, the age of aristocratic snail collecting was definitively over. Some former collectors were still alive, but they occupied a different world. The elaborate social structures that had supported their hobby, the societies, the journals, the exhibitions, had vanished. The estates that had provided resources for large-scale collecting were divided or sold. The leisure time that had made such pursuits possible was consumed by the need to rebuild lives and fortunes in a transformed society. A few individuals continued collecting on a smaller scale. The practice never entirely disappeared, but it had lost its social dimension, that sense of participating in an elite community united by shared passion. Snail collecting became what it had been before the 1760s, an individual eccentricity rather than an organized pursuit. The quarterly journal, Observations sur les gastéropodes de France, ceased publication in 1792. The final issue contained a poignant note from the editor explaining that circumstances made continued publication impossible. A complete set of the journal's 17 years of issues survives in several French libraries. Scholars occasionally consult them, mining the articles for historical data on French snail populations and distributions. The Société des Amateurs d'Escargots attempted to reconvene in 1800. 9 men attended the first meeting, all that remained of the original 40 members, plus a few newcomers curious about the organization. They met in a cafe rather than a rented room, and the atmosphere was nostalgic rather than forward-looking. These survivors exchanged stories of what had become of their collections, of fellow members who had died or emigrated. They agreed to meet monthly, but the gatherings became increasingly sporadic. By 1803, they had stopped entirely. Looking back from our modern perspective, the story of France's aristocratic snail collectors seems almost impossibly quaint. Here were men of education and privilege, living at the cusp of world historical transformation, devoting themselves to garden mollusks. Their concerns, the precise spiral of a shell, the optimal diet for breeding stock, the proper way to catalog specimens, seem absurdly trivial against the backdrop of revolution, war, and social upheaval. Yet perhaps that very triviality has something to teach us. These collectors were seeking meaning and order in a world that provided less and less of both as the 18th century progressed. They created elaborate structures of significance around fundamentally insignificant objects because doing so gave them control, provided certainty, offered a realm where rational inquiry could yield clear answers. When their world collapsed, when revolutions swept away the social order that had made their hobby possible, the snails remained just snails. The grand theories of shell development, the heated debates over taxonomy, the bitter rivalries over collection supremacy, all of it revealed itself as a game, an elaborate structure built on nothing. But the observations endured. The careful notes about where different species thrived, the documentation of variation across regions, the preserved specimens themselves, these things had value independent of the social world that produced them. Science, real science, can emerge from unexpected sources, even from the frivolous hobbies of a doomed aristocracy. The snail collectors of 18th century France left behind very little. A few scattered specimens in museum collections, some brittle journals in library archives, occasional mentions in letters and memoirs. Most of their names are forgotten except by specialists in the period. Their great collections, assembled with such care and expense, were destroyed or dispersed. What remains is a strange historical footnote, a reminder that every age has its obsessions and that even the most stable-seeming social orders can vanish with shocking speed. Those elegant gentlemen crawling through gardens in search of perfect shells could not imagine a world without aristocratic privilege, without the leisure and resources to pursue elaborate hobbies, without the social structures that gave their collecting meaning. They found out what such a world looked like. Most of them did not enjoy the discovery, and somewhere in France today, in gardens and forests, descendants of the snails they once collected continue their slow progress through the underbrush, utterly indifferent to the rise and fall of human civilizations, to the passions and follies of those who once studied them so intently. The snails persist. The collectors are dust. History, as always, belongs to those who survive, rather than those who seem important at any given moment. The morning of June 18th, 1815, dawned grey and uncertain over the Belgian countryside near Waterloo. As Napoleon and Wellington prepared their forces for the battle that would decide the fate of Europe, a different kind of preparation was underway in Brussels. Nathan Rothschild's agent, a man whose name has been lost to history, stood ready with a basket containing 4 carrier pigeons. These birds would reach London a full day before official dispatches, carrying news of Napoleon's defeat. The intelligence allowed Rothschild to make strategic financial moves that secured his family's fortune and demonstrated, in the most dramatic possible way, the value of rapid communication. The pigeon, that commonplace urban nuisance, had proven itself a tool of empire. This moment marked not the beginning of pigeon post. Humans had been using birds to carry messages for millennia, but rather a turning point in how the British Empire understood and utilized these feathered messengers. Over the following decades, carrier pigeons would become integral to Victorian commerce, military operations, and imperial administration in ways that seem almost inconceivable to us now, accustomed as we are to instant electronic communication. To understand how this happened, you must first understand the pigeon itself, or more specifically, the variety known as the carrier pigeon or homing pigeon. These birds possess an extraordinary navigational ability that scientists still do not fully comprehend even today. Released in an unfamiliar location, a carrier pigeon can find its way home across hundreds of miles, flying at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, navigating by means that appear to involve the Earth's magnetic field, the position of the Sun, and possibly even infrasound, extremely low-frequency sounds inaudible to human ears. The Victorians did not understand the mechanism, but they recognized the utility. Here was a communications technology that required no infrastructure beyond lofts for housing the birds. It worked regardless of terrain. Pigeons could fly over mountains, forests, and bodies of water that would slow or stop a human messenger. It was relatively fast, certainly faster than any alternative available in the early 19th century, and it was, compared to maintaining networks of telegraph lines or relay stations, remarkably inexpensive. The British East India Company was among the first to recognize these advantages on an imperial scale. By the 1820s, company officials in India were experimenting with pigeon post for communication between administrative centers. The challenges were considerable. India's climate was hostile to European breeds of carrier pigeons. The distances were vast. Local predatory birds posed constant threats, but the potential rewards justified the investment. A message that might take weeks to travel by conventional means could be conveyed in days by pigeon. For a commercial enterprise operating across a subcontinent, this speed advantage translated directly into profit. Market intelligence that arrived ahead of competitors, early warning of potential unrest, rapid coordination between distant facilities. All of this became possible through avian messengers. The company established its first major pigeon loft in Calcutta in 1824. The facility was overseen by a former British Army officer named Thomas Bellingham, whose previous experience consisted mainly of keeping racing pigeons as a hobby in Kent. Bellingham approached his new role with the methodical seriousness that characterized so much of British imperial administration. He began by importing breeding stock from England, 60 birds transported by ship, a journey that took months and during which half the birds died from disease or stress. The survivors formed the foundation of the East India Company's pigeon post system. Bellingham kept meticulous records, breeding lineages, flight times, success rates, mortality causes. His journals, preserved in the British Library, reveal a man completely absorbed in the minutiae of pigeon husbandry. The birds were housed in a purpose-built loft 3 stories high, with separate sections for breeding pairs, young birds, and active messengers. Each bird was tagged with a unique identifier and logged in a master registry. Diet was carefully controlled, a mixture of grains that Bellingham adjusted based on the bird's performance. Training began when birds were 6 weeks old, with progressively longer flights to build their navigational abilities and physical stamina. The system expanded gradually. By 1830, the East India Company maintained lofts in Bombay, Madras, and Delhi, in addition to Calcutta. Each loft housed between 100 and 300 birds. Bellingham had trained Indian staff to manage day-to-day operations, though he maintained supervisory control and continued his breeding program. The messages themselves were written on extremely thin paper in tiny script, then rolled tightly and inserted into small metal capsules attached to the bird's legs. A skilled clerk could fit approximately 200 words onto a single message slip, enough for brief reports on prices, shipping schedules, or administrative matters. The limitations were obvious. You could only send messages to a bird's home loft, not to arbitrary destinations. The capacity was limited by the size of the message capsule. The system worked in only one direction. A pigeon released from an outlying station could fly to headquarters, but then had to be physically transported back before it could carry another message. Weather could ground the birds or blow them off course. Predators occasionally intercepted messengers in flight. Yet despite these constraints, the pigeon post proved its value repeatedly. During periods of unrest, when conventional communications were disrupted, the birds often got through. During the First Afghan War in the 1840s, besieged British garrisons used pigeons to maintain contact with relief forces. The birds flew over terrain that was impassable to messengers on horseback, through regions controlled by hostile forces. Back in Britain, commercial interests were developing their own pigeon post networks. Stock exchanges, newspapers, and trading houses all saw advantages in rapid communication. The Reuters news agency, founded by Paul Julius Reuter in 1851, initially used carrier pigeons to bridge a gap in telegraph coverage between Brussels and Aachen, allowing the company to get financial news from Paris to German markets faster than competitors. This was the key insight. Even as telegraph technology developed and expanded, there remained gaps and bottlenecks where pigeons offered advantages. Telegraph lines could be cut, either by accident or sabotage. They required maintenance and infrastructure. They were vulnerable to disruption. Pigeons provided redundancy and resilience. The British military formalized this understanding in the 1850s, establishing the Army Pigeon Service. The Crimean War demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the system. Pigeons successfully carried intelligence from forward positions to headquarters, but losses were high. Russian forces, quick to recognize the threat, deployed marksmen specifically to shoot down messenger birds. The British responded by releasing birds in groups, hoping that at least some would get through. The breeding programs became increasingly sophisticated. Handlers sought to develop bloodlines that combined speed, endurance, homing accuracy, and resilience to harsh conditions. They experimented with different training regimens, testing whether birds that learned their routes in stages performed better than those sent on long flights immediately. They studied the impact of diet on performance, the optimal age for active service, the best methods for maintaining the bird's health in various climates. Private pigeon fanciers' organizations proliferated across Britain. These groups, typically composed of working-class men, bred and raced pigeons as a hobby. They developed their own expertise, sometimes surpassing that of military and commercial operations. The military began recruiting from these clubs, offering payment for exceptional birds and consulting with top breeders on bloodline development. By the 1860s, a curious social dynamic had emerged. The pigeon fancy, the community of breeders and racers, occupied a peculiar position in Victorian society. It was predominantly working class in composition, yet it commanded respect from social superiors because of the genuine expertise these men possessed. A coal miner who bred champion racing pigeons might find himself consulted by military officers or wealthy merchants. The economics of pigeon breeding became complex. A proven champion bird could sell for substantial sums, £50 or more, equivalent to a year's wages for a laborer. Breeding rights could be licensed. Stud fees were charged. A whole market developed around pigeon genetics, with debates about optimal breeding strategies that paralleled similar discussions in horse breeding circles. The birds themselves were meticulously documented. Pedigrees were maintained with the same care applied to thoroughbred horses. Physical characteristics were analyzed and categorized. Performance data was recorded and studied. The Victorian passion for classification and systematic knowledge found full expression in pigeon fancy culture. Training methods varied, but shared common elements. Young birds underwent progressively longer flights, always returning to their home loft. The process was called training to the road, teaching the bird to navigate the route it would eventually fly, carrying messages. Some trainers advocated for training flights at dawn, believing birds navigated better in morning light. Others preferred afternoon releases. There were debates about whether birds should be trained in all weather conditions or only in favorable weather. The lofts themselves became increasingly sophisticated. Ventilation systems, feeding schedules, cleaning protocols, every aspect of pigeon husbandry was analyzed and optimized. Some large operations employed full-time veterinarians to maintain flock health. Diseases could devastate a loft, and preventing outbreaks required constant vigilance. But what was it actually like for these birds, these living communication devices? The pigeons lived their lives in a state of purposeful captivity. They were fed and sheltered, protected from predators and weather. Yet they were also bred for a specific function, trained through repetition, and used in ways that sometimes killed them. The relationship between handler and bird was complex. The best handlers developed genuine affection for their charges, learning to recognize individual birds by sight, understanding each one's quirks and capabilities. They celebrated when favored birds returned safely from long flights. They mourned losses to predators or weather. Yet this affection coexisted with utilitarian purpose. These were working birds, tools of commerce and empire. When necessary, they were expended. During military operations, birds might be sent on missions with very low survival probabilities. The calculation was cold. The value of the intelligence outweighed the cost of losing birds. As the 1860s progressed and telegraph networks expanded, some predicted the end of pigeon post. Why maintain expensive flocks of birds when a wire could carry messages instantly? But this prediction proved premature. The pigeons continued to find niches where they excelled, places where telegraph lines did not reach, situations where redundancy was valuable, emergencies when other systems failed. The question that emerges from this history is whether the Victorians, in their systematic exploitation of pigeon navigation, truly understood what they had created. They had built a communications network that spanned an empire, that operated independently of infrastructure, that could function when all other systems broke down. But they had done so without understanding the fundamental mechanism that made it possible. They had harnessed a natural capability through selective breeding and systematic training, yet the mystery of how pigeons actually found their way home remained unsolved. And as the empire grew, as the demands on these avian messengers increased, how far could the system be pushed before it reached its limits? The 1870s brought dramatic expansion to Britain's pigeon post networks, driven by imperial ambition, commercial competition, and a growing recognition that multiple communication systems provided strategic advantages. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 had demonstrated this principle with startling clarity when the besieged city of Paris maintained contact with the outside world, primarily through carrier pigeons and hot air balloons. The siege of Paris became a pivotal moment in the history of avian communication. When Prussian forces surrounded the city in September 1870, cutting rail and telegraph lines, the French government found itself isolated from the rest of the country. In desperation, they turned to pigeons. Over the course of the 4-month siege, approximately 350 pigeons carried messages out of Paris. The birds were transported out of the city by balloon. Since pigeons could only fly home, not to arbitrary destinations, they first had to be taken beyond the siege lines before being released to return. British observers followed these developments with intense interest. Military attachés sent detailed reports analyzing the French system's strengths and weaknesses. The takeaway was clear. In extremis, when modern infrastructure failed, these ancient messengers could prove invaluable. The British military responded with increased investment. The Army Pigeon Service expanded its breeding programs and established new lofts at strategic locations throughout the empire. Malta, Gibraltar, Cyprus, Alexandria, Aden, every significant British naval or military installation gained pigeon facilities. The logic was straightforward. If telegraph cables were cut or wireless stations destroyed, the birds provided a backup communication channel. But the most ambitious expansion occurred in India, where the network established by Thomas Bellingham in the 1820s had grown into something far more complex and extensive. By 1875, the British administration in India maintained over 40 major pigeon lofts and employed more than 200 staff dedicated exclusively to pigeon operations. The Indian system had developed unique characteristics adapted to subcontinental conditions. The climate remained a challenge. The intense heat of summer reduced bird performance, while monsoon rains could ground flocks for days. Handlers had discovered through trial and error that birds performed best when flights were scheduled for early morning or late evening, avoiding the worst of the midday heat. Disease management required constant attention. Outbreaks of avian diseases could sweep through lofts with devastating speed in the warm, humid climate. The British brought in veterinarians with experience in tropical medicine, adapted protocols from livestock management, and maintained strict quarantine procedures for new birds. The predator problem had proven more difficult to solve. India's diverse raptor population, hawks, eagles, falcons, viewed carrier pigeons as convenient meals. Handlers tried various countermeasures. Some lofts employed guards armed with rifles to shoot predatory birds near release and arrival points. Others experimented with releasing pigeons in groups, hoping that at least some would reach their destination. A few attempted training birds to fly at lower altitudes where raptors hunted less frequently, though this risked other hazards. The cultural dimensions of pigeon keeping in India added another layer of complexity. Indigenous communities had their own traditions of keeping and racing pigeons, practices that long predated the British presence. The colonial administration initially dismissed this local expertise, insisting on European methods and imported bloodlines. But pragmatic handlers gradually recognized that Indian breeds, adapted to local conditions over generations, often outperformed European imports. This recognition led to experimental crossbreeding programs. British handlers began acquiring birds from local breeders, crossing them with European stock and selecting offspring for desired traits. The resulting hybrid birds combined the heat tolerance and disease resistance of Indian breeds with the size and speed of European carriers. The individual responsible for much of this hybridization work was a man named William Prescott, who had come to India in 1867 as a junior administrator and discovered a passion for pigeon breeding. Prescott's journals, housed in the Oriental and India Office collections at the British Library, provide extraordinary detail about his experimental breeding programs. Prescott approached pigeon breeding with scientific rigor unusual for the era. He maintained detailed records of every breeding pair, tracking inheritance of physical characteristics across multiple generations. He measured flight speeds over standard distances, logged arrival times, and calculated success rates. He experimented with different feed combinations, testing their impact on bird performance. He kept birds from different bloodlines in separate sections of his loft, creating controlled conditions for comparison. His work was slow and painstaking. Pigeons reach sexual maturity at about 6 months and typically breed once or twice per year. Meaningful results from breeding experiments required years of patient observation. Prescott spent 15 years refining his hybrid lines, gradually developing birds that he believed were optimally suited to Indian conditions. The results were impressive. By the early 1880s, Prescott's hybrid pigeons were achieving flight times 20 to 30% faster than pure European breeds over comparable distances in Indian climate conditions. Their survival rates were higher. They showed greater resistance to local diseases. The colonial administration took notice, and Prescott found himself promoted to oversee pigeon operations across multiple provinces. But even as the Indian system reached new levels of sophistication, challenges remained. The sheer distances involved in subcontinental communication strained the capabilities of even the finest birds. A pigeon could reliably fly perhaps 400 miles in a single day under optimal conditions. India's geography spanned thousands of miles. Multi-stage relay systems were necessary for long-distance communication, with birds passing messages from loft to loft across the country. These relay systems required precise coordination. A message might be carried from Delhi to Agra by one bird, transcribed and forwarded to Lucknow by another, then on to Calcutta through several more relay points. Each transcription introduced potential for error. Each transfer added delay. Weather disruptions at any point in the chain could break the entire sequence. The administrative overhead was substantial. Each loft required staffing, feeding, maintenance. The birds themselves represented significant capital investment. A major loft might house 300 birds, each worth several pounds. Training costs, veterinary care, facilities maintenance. The total expenses ran to thousands of pounds annually for the larger installations. Was it worth the cost? The British administration clearly thought so, given continued investment. But the calculations were not purely economic. The strategic value of communication redundancy, the symbolic importance of maintaining control across vast distances, the simple fact that alternatives were not always reliable. These factors justified expenses that might not pencil out in strict cost-benefit terms. Meanwhile, back in Britain, commercial pigeon post was evolving in different directions. The telegraph had largely displaced pigeons for routine business communication, but niche applications remained. Newspapers still used birds to transmit breaking news stories from locations without telegraph access. Some shipping companies maintained pigeon lofts at ports, using birds to send advance notice of cargo arrivals. The most unexpected commercial development was the creation of a regular pigeon post service between London and Paris. Established in 1877 by a French entrepreneur named Henri Duval, this service capitalized on the fact that telegraph messages faced delays at channel crossings and international borders. Duval's pigeons flew directly across the English Channel, covering the distance in 4 to 5 hours under good conditions. The service operated on a subscription model. Clients paid an annual fee for access, then a per-message charge for each communication sent. Messages were limited to 100 words and had to be encoded. Duval would not transmit sensitive commercial information in plain language, recognizing that lost messages might fall into competitors' hands. The channel crossing posed unique challenges. Open water offered no landmarks for navigation, and birds sometimes became disoriented, especially in fog or high winds. Duval addressed this by training birds on the route extensively before putting them into active service. Young birds made the crossing dozens of times as training flights before being trusted with paid messages. Loss rates were relatively high. Approximately 15% of messages failed to arrive, but for certain types of urgent financial intelligence, this was acceptable. Duval's service persisted until the late 1880s, when improvements in telegraph service and the introduction of underwater cables finally made it economically unviable. The racing pigeon fancy in Britain grew explosively during this period. What had begun as a working-class hobby became a national obsession, with clubs proliferating across industrial cities. These clubs organized races over progressively longer distances, releasing hundreds of birds simultaneously from distant locations and competing to see whose birds reached home first. The races became social events, drawing spectators and wagering. Top birds achieved celebrity status, their names and pedigrees known to thousands of enthusiasts. Breeding rights to champion racers commanded extraordinary prices. A bird named the Flying Dutchman sold for £96 in 1882, more than most working men earned in 2 years. The social dynamics of pigeon racing reflected broader Victorian class tensions and aspirations. This was one of few arenas where working-class men could achieve recognition based purely on expertise and the quality of their birds. A mill worker who bred champions earned respect from social superiors who might otherwise never acknowledge his existence. Yet the hobby also reinforced class boundaries. The truly expensive birds, the elite bloodlines, the most sophisticated breeding operations, these remained largely in the hands of wealthy fanciers who could afford the investment. Working-class breeders operated on tighter margins, making do with less, competing against better-resourced rivals. The military and commercial operations both benefited from and contributed to racing culture. They recruited from racing clubs, purchasing exceptional birds and hiring top handlers. Military pigeon services sponsored some races, offering prizes and gaining access to performance data on competing birds. The relationship was symbiotic. Racing provided the competitive pressure that drove continuous improvement in bird quality, while military and commercial applications provided financial support and prestige. Training methods continued to evolve. Handlers experimented with different approaches, debating optimal strategies in club meetings and specialized publications. One school of thought held that birds should be trained exclusively on the exact routes they would fly operationally. Another argued for varied training locations to develop more robust navigational abilities. Some handlers advocated for rigorous training schedules with flights multiple times per week. Others preferred longer rest periods between training flights. The birds themselves remained enigmatic. Despite decades of systematic observation, handlers still did not truly understand how pigeons navigated. They could see that birds oriented themselves quickly after release, often circling briefly before setting off in the correct direction. They knew that birds seemed to navigate accurately even in overcast conditions when the sun was not visible. They observed that some individual birds were more reliable than others, that certain bloodlines consistently produced better navigators, but the underlying mechanism remained mysterious. Some theorists proposed that birds navigated by smell, following scent trails back to familiar territory. Others suggested sensitivity to the Earth's magnetic field. A few speculated about unknown senses entirely, capabilities humans could not detect or measure with available instruments. The handlers worked with what they had: empirical observation and accumulated practical knowledge. They selected for traits they could measure: speed, homing accuracy, endurance. They developed husbandry practices that kept birds healthy and performing well. They created training protocols that, whatever the underlying mechanism, demonstrably improved bird performance. By the mid-1880s, Britain's various pigeon post networks, military, commercial, and civilian, represented a substantial investment of capital and expertise. Thousands of birds were in active service. hundreds of people earned their livings managing, breeding, and training them. Specialized industries had emerged to serve pigeon operations, manufacturers of message capsules, loft equipment suppliers, feed merchants specializing in pigeon nutrition. Yet even as this elaborate infrastructure reached its peak, the forces that would eventually displace it were gathering strength. Telegraph networks continued expanding. Telephone technology was developing rapidly. Other forms of rapid communication were emerging that would eventually make pigeon post obsolete for most applications. The question was not whether pigeons would be displaced, but when, and what role, if any, they would retain in a world of increasingly sophisticated electronic communication. Would they remain a backup system, maintained for emergencies? Would they retreat to purely sporting applications, divorced from practical communication needs? Or would they fade away entirely, remembered only as a curious footnote in the history of human communication? And what of the handlers, the breeders, the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on these living messengers? What would become of their accumulated expertise, their carefully developed bloodlines, their life's work dedicated to harnessing a natural capability they could utilize but never fully comprehend? The 1890s brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in how Britain's empire viewed its pigeon post networks. The infrastructure remained in place, the birds continued flying their routes, the handlers still performed their daily routines. But the confident expansion of previous decades had slowed. Conversations in military planning offices and commercial boardrooms increasingly centered on newer technologies, telephones, improved telegraph systems, and the tantalizing possibility of wireless communication. Yet paradoxically, this was also the period when pigeon post achieved its greatest technical sophistication and faced its most demanding operational tests. The system had matured, benefiting from decades of selective breeding, refined training methods, and accumulated practical knowledge. The birds flying missions in the 1890s were substantially superior to their predecessors, faster, more reliable, better adapted to varied conditions. The Boer War, which began in 1899, provided the most comprehensive test of British military pigeon operations to date. South Africa's terrain, vast distances, rugged mountains, sparse infrastructure, seemed almost designed to favor avian messengers over electronic alternatives. Telegraph lines could be and frequently were cut by Boer commandos. Traditional mounted messengers faced ambush. But pigeons, released from besieged garrisons or forward positions, could fly over hostile territory to reach British headquarters. The military shipped over 400 trained carrier pigeons to South Africa at the war's outset. Additional birds followed as the conflict progressed. Lofts were established at major bases and key towns. The birds were assigned to specific routes, trained on local terrain to the extent possible given wartime constraints. The results were mixed, revealing both the capabilities and limitations of the system under actual combat conditions. In certain situations, pigeons proved invaluable. During the siege of Ladysmith, which lasted 4 months, from November 1899 to February 1900, carrier pigeons maintained sporadic contact between the besieged garrison and relief forces. These messages, though limited in content, provided crucial intelligence on the garrison's condition and helped coordinate relief efforts. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Russell, commanding the garrison's signal operations, kept detailed records of pigeon performance during the siege. His reports, archived at the National Army Museum in London, provide remarkable insight into operational realities. Of 63 pigeons released during the siege, 41 reached their destinations successfully, a success rate of approximately 65%. The failures resulted from various causes: predation by local raptors, disorientation in unfamiliar territory, exhaustion over the long distances involved, and in at least 3 documented cases, birds being shot down by enemy fire. Russell's reports convey both appreciation for the birds' service and frustration with their limitations. Messages had to be kept extremely brief due to capsule size constraints. There was no way to confirm whether a message had been received until a response arrived or didn't. The one-directional nature of pigeon communication meant birds had to be physically transported into the besieged town before they could carry messages out, requiring dangerous blockade-running missions. Yet for all these limitations, Russell concluded that the pigeons had proven their worth. In several instances, they had conveyed intelligence that could not have been transmitted by any other available means. The psychological value of maintaining any form of communication with the outside world, however tenuous, was substantial for garrison morale. The Boer War also revealed unexpected vulnerabilities. The Boer forces, quick to recognize the British reliance on pigeons, organized systematic efforts to disrupt the service. Marksmen were specifically tasked with shooting messenger birds. More innovatively, the Boers captured some British pigeons and released them with false messages, attempting to deceive British commanders about conditions in besieged towns or the movements of Boer forces. This latter tactic had limited success. The British had procedures for authenticating messages, including code phrases and the physical characteristics of message capsules. But the mere fact that it was attempted indicated how seriously both sides took avian communication. Back in Britain, the racing pigeon fancy continued to flourish even as commercial pigeon post declined. The final years of the 19th century saw racing evolve into an increasingly organized sport with standardized rules, formal competitions, and substantial prize money. The National Homing Union, founded in 1896, brought coordination to what had been a fragmented collection of local clubs. The racing culture developed its own rituals and traditions. Clock timing systems were introduced to precisely measure when birds returned to their lofts, allowing for accurate determination of race winners. Specialized transport services emerged, moving birds to release points for races. Breeding became ever more scientific, with pedigrees tracked through multiple generations and performance data analyzed to identify superior bloodlines. William Osman, a coal miner from Yorkshire, exemplified the passionate dedication of working-class fanciers. Osman spent virtually every spare shilling on his pigeons, maintaining a loft of 30 birds behind his modest terraced house. He rose at 4 each morning to tend them before his shift in the mines and returned to the loft immediately after work, often spending hours cleaning, feeding, and training his birds. His diary, donated to a local museum by his granddaughter in 1967, reveals the depth of his involvement. He recorded every detail of his birds' lives: what they ate, when they molted, how they performed in training flights. He gave them names and wrote about them as individuals, noting personality differences and preferences. Duchess showed no interest in the new nesting box, reads one entry. Diamond continues to be aggressive toward Blackbird during feeding, must separate them. Osman never won a major race. His birds were good, but not exceptional. Yet the hobby gave his life structure and meaning beyond the grueling routine of mine work. It connected him to a community of fellow enthusiasts. It provided opportunities for pride and achievement in a life that offered few such opportunities. When he died in 1912 from a mining accident, his club held a memorial race in his honor, releasing 100 birds from the colliery where he had worked. His story was repeated thousands of times, across industrial Britain. Working men finding purpose and community through pigeons, building something beautiful and meaningful within lives constrained by hard labor and limited prospects. Meanwhile, the commercial applications that had driven much of the 19th century expansion were rapidly diminishing. Reuters discontinued its pigeon service in 1890, relying entirely on telegraph for news transmission. Shipping companies phased out their lofts as improved port telegraph facilities made bird messengers redundant. The London-Paris service shut down in 1888 after underwater telegraph cables made it commercially unviable. By 1900, commercial pigeon post in Britain had essentially ceased to exist, except for a few specialized applications. One persistent use was in areas where telegraph lines were impractical. Lighthouses, for instance, sometimes maintained pigeons for emergency communication. A few remote mining operations used birds to send urgent messages when their limited telegraph connections failed. The colonial pigeon networks followed a similar trajectory. The extensive Indian system, which had grown to over 50 major lofts by 1895, began contracting. Telegraph coverage in India had expanded dramatically, reaching most significant administrative centers. The expense of maintaining large pigeon operations became harder to justify when electronic alternatives existed. William Prescott, who had devoted decades to developing hybrid pigeon breeds optimized for Indian conditions, watched this decline with resignation. In his final report, before retirement in 1901, he noted that the system he had helped build was being overtaken by technological progress. Yet he argued that complete elimination would be premature. The telegraph depends upon wires that can be cut, stations that can be destroyed, he wrote. Pigeons require only their lofts and handlers. In times of unrest or war, this independence from vulnerable infrastructure retains value. His argument carried some weight. The military decided to maintain reduced pigeon services at strategic locations, preserving the capability while acknowledging it was no longer a primary communication method. Loft operations scaled back dramatically. Where a major installation might once have housed 300 birds, now 50 or 75 were considered sufficient. The transition created unexpected challenges. Decades of selective breeding had created bloodlines specifically adapted to particular routes and conditions. As lofts closed and operations consolidated, valuable genetic lineages risked being lost. Some handlers, recognizing this, made efforts to preserve superior birds. They donated breeding pairs to racing clubs or sold them to private fanciers. A few retired handlers established their own private lofts, maintaining bloodlines they had spent years developing. The accumulated expertise faced similar risks. Men who had devoted their careers to pigeon handling found themselves redundant as operations contracted. Some transitioned to other roles within military or commercial organizations. Others found employment in the growing racing fancy, bringing professional knowledge to what had been primarily amateur operations. Some simply retired, their specialized skills no longer needed. The First World War, beginning in 1914, brought a temporary reversal to this decline. Modern warfare's unprecedented scale and destructiveness created conditions where backup communication systems proved essential. Telegraph lines were constantly destroyed by artillery bombardment. Telephone wires were cut. Radio, though improving, was still unreliable and vulnerable to enemy interference. Carrier pigeons were hastily pressed back into service. Britain mobilized its remaining military pigeon operations and recruited extensively from racing clubs. France, Germany, and other combatants did likewise, Hundreds of thousands of pigeons served during the war, carrying messages from frontline positions to headquarters, from forward observers to artillery batteries, from cut-off units to friendly lines. The conditions were horrific. Birds were released from trenches into skies filled with poison gas, explosive shells, and small arms fire. They flew through smoke and fire, navigating devastated landscapes where familiar landmarks had been obliterated. Casualty rates were appalling. Some estimates suggest only 10% of messages sent by pigeon during major offensives successfully reached their destinations. Yet that 10% sometimes made crucial differences. Messages that got through could call for artillery support, warn of impending attacks, or request medical evacuation for wounded. The most famous case involved an American unit, the Lost Battalion, which used its last pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami, to call for relief after being surrounded by German forces. Cher Ami successfully delivered the message despite being wounded, saving the unit. The bird became a symbol of avian service, taxidermied and displayed at the Smithsonian Institution. But the war also demonstrated definitively that pigeons could not serve as a primary communication system in modern conflict. They were too vulnerable, too limited in capacity, too dependent on favorable conditions. They could supplement other methods, provide redundancy, serve in emergencies. But the future of military communication lay elsewhere, in radio, in improved telephone systems, in technologies that did not depend on living creatures flying through hostile airspace. The post-war period saw rapid demobilization of pigeon services. The military retained small operations for specialized purposes, but the extensive networks of the Victorian era were gone. The Indian Pigeon Service, which had persisted in reduced form into the 1920s, was finally discontinued in 1927. The last military pigeons in regular British service were retired in 1948, replaced entirely by electronic communications. What remained was the racing fancy, which had actually grown during and after the war, as veterans familiar with military pigeon operations joined civilian clubs. Racing became more popular than ever in the interwar period, evolving into a working-class sport that rivaled football in some regions for community engagement and passionate following. The expertise that had been developed for commercial and military purposes found new expression in competitive racing. Breeding techniques refined over decades of operational use now served purely sporting goals. Training methods designed to produce reliable military messengers were adapted to create champion races. The knowledge persisted, transformed, but not lost. Looking back across this history, what strikes you is the sheer improbability of it all. For several decades, the most powerful empire in human history relied significantly on birds, creatures whose navigational abilities were not understood, could not be fully controlled, and depended on biological capabilities that might fail at any moment. Yet it worked. Not perfectly, not without losses and failures, but sufficiently well that serious people devoted substantial resources to maintaining and expanding the system. Thousands of individuals built careers around pigeon handling. Fortunes were made and lost based on intelligence conveyed by birds. Military victories and defeats sometimes hinged on whether a particular pigeon successfully completed its flight. The pigeons themselves remain mysterious even now. Modern science has made progress in understanding avian navigation. We know about magnetoreception, about the role of visual landmarks, about olfactory navigation, but we still cannot fully explain how a pigeon released hundreds of miles from home can consistently find its way back. The complete mechanism remains incompletely understood. Those Victorian handlers, working with even less knowledge, achieved remarkable things through patient observation and systematic experimentation. They could not explain why their methods worked, but they knew that they did work. They developed practices that reliably produced results even without theoretical understanding of underlying causes. There is something almost poignant about the end of this era. The last handlers, who had devoted their lives to pigeon operations, retired and died, taking with them personal knowledge and intuitions that were never fully documented. The final working birds were released or sold to racing clubs, their operational bloodlines merging into sporting populations. The lofts were dismantled or converted to other purposes. In museums and archives, you can still find remnants, message capsules in display cases, photographs of handlers with their birds, breeding ledgers documenting generations of carefully cultivated bloodlines, reports analyzing flight times and success rates. These fragments hint at a lost world, a time when the British Empire's reach depended partly on creatures that weighed less than a pound and could be held in two hands. And somewhere today, in lofts across Britain and around the world, descendants of those Victorian messenger birds still fly. They race for sport now, rather than carrying vital intelligence or commercial messages. But they still possess that extraordinary ability to find home across vast distances, still demonstrate the navigational capabilities that made them useful to empires and armies. The pigeons endure, outlasting the empire that once relied upon them, indifferent to the rise and fall of human civilizations, continuing their ancient biological imperative to return home, regardless of obstacles or distance. They were here before we harnessed them for our purposes. They will be here long after our technologies have evolved beyond any current imagination. In that persistence, perhaps, lies a final lesson about the relationship between human ambition and natural capability. We can use what nature provides, but we cannot fully own it, and it will outlast our temporary needs.